The Lighthouse of Regrets. The faceless figure in the yellow slicker threw Elias through the glass of the lantern room, and as he fell backward into the void of gray vapor, 100 years of photographs, all of them the same moment, all of them the day he failed to save Clara from the tide, swirled around him like snow. 13 hours earlier, Elias had stepped out of the rain and into the Driftwood tavern. The wind howled outside as he pushed open the heavy oak door. His tan canvas duster coat was splattered with mud at the hem. His leather boots creaked on the threshold as he stepped inside, shaking a wet umbrella. The cold had bitten at his face for the last 3 miles of the journey, and now the warmth of the tavern hit him like a fist to the stomach. He squinted against the dim indoor light, breathing heavily. Above his head, oil lamps hung from low timber beams, casting their yellow light in islands across the room. The locals didn't look up at first. They sat in clusters. Fishermen, dock workers, the sort of men whose hands bore the permanent scars of their labor. But as Elias moved deeper into the tavern, the conversation died. It was the kind of silence that came before violence. He walked to the scarred wooden bar, his footsteps loud and solitary. The bartender was a man with a thick gray beard and a missing thumb on his left hand. He was wiping a glass when Elias placed a folded, yellowed newspaper on the counter. The headline read, "Mariner's Light Extinguished, 3 Missing." Beneath the text was a grainy black and white photograph of a lighthouse, white stone against a black sky. The date on the newspaper was October 14th, 1924. Elias pointed a trembling index finger at the photograph. "I'm looking for the road to the point," he said. His voice was raspy, desperate. "Does it still hold?" The bartender stopped wiping his glass. He leaned over the bar, his face inches from Elias's. Then, slowly and deliberately, he took a wet rag and wiped it directly over the newspaper photo. The water from the rag blurred the lighthouse into a smudge of black ink. "Road's gone to the tide," the bartender said. His voice was low, threatening. "And the light, that stays in the dark where it belongs." Elias reached into his inner coat pocket and pulled out a silver locket. He snapped it open. Inside was a small photograph of a young woman with a white ribbon in her hair. He stared at it for 3 seconds. 3 seconds in which the entire tavern seemed to hold its breath before snapping it shut. When he turned from the bar, 4 men in thick wool sweaters stood in his path. They didn't move. They simply stood there, blocking him, their shoulders broad and their faces blank. Elias squared his shoulders and gripped the handle of his heavy leather satchel. Outside, the rain had turned vicious. It drummed against the wooden porch and cascaded off the tavern roof like a curtain. When Elias stepped out into it, a tall villager grabbed his shoulder from behind, spinning him around. The villager's hand was rough, scarred by fishing lines. His grip tightened on Elias's collar, and Elias winced as he was yanked backward. "You don't go to the point," the tall villager said. His breath smelled like alcohol and smoke. But Elias didn't respond. He drove his knee upward, and the man's grip loosened just enough. Elias twisted free, felt the rain on his face, and then a second villager, shorter and wider than the first, kicked his satchel away. The leather bag skidded across the mud and came to rest against the tavern wall. Elias lunged forward, grabbing the tall man's waist and driving his shoulder into the man's stomach. They fell together into the mud, bodies colliding, grunts of exertion mixing with the sound of the rain. In the sludge, Elias caught a glimpse of the man's face. He wasn't angry, not really. He looked terrified. His eyes were wide, pleading, as if he were begging Elias to stop, to turn back, to do anything but continue toward the lighthouse. But Elias hit him anyway. A short, sharp right hook to the jaw. The man's eyes glazed over, and his body went slack. Red blood mixed with the gray mud on his chin. The short villager swung a wooden plank at Elias's head. Elias ducked. The wood whistled over his head. He swept the villager's leg with his boot, and the man crashed down hard onto his back, the wind knocked out of him. Elias scrambled up, grabbed his satchel, and ran toward the dark tree line. Behind him, he heard the shouts of the other men, but he didn't stop. He ran through the twisted pines, his lungs burning, his boots splashing through puddles, until the lights of the tavern were nothing but distant ghosts behind him. The cliff-top path was narrow and treacherous. Elias followed it with one hand on the rock face, his other holding his satchel close to his chest. The storm had begun to break apart, revealing glimpses of the moon between the clouds. The wind picked up, howling across the open rocks. And then he saw it. The lighthouse loomed ahead, a white stone tower with crumbling mortar. No light showed from the lantern room. The structure looked as if it hadn't been maintained in decades. Elias pulled a folded letter from his pocket. The return address was the lighthouse itself, dated only 3 days ago. The ink was fresh, dark blue, and remarkably steady. He reached the rusty iron gate and pushed it. It didn't creak. The hinges were bright, freshly oiled. When Elias looked down, he saw footprints in the soft earth leading toward the tower door. They were tiny, delicate, like those of a child or a small woman. The tread was modern, the mark of a sneaker sole. Elias's breath caught in his throat. He looked up at the top of the tower, and then it happened. The giant Fresnel lens at the top rotated once, slowly and deliberately. A beam of piercing, violet-hued light swept across the sky. It wasn't a normal warning light. It was cold and unnervingly bright, a color that didn't belong in nature. The light was accompanied by a low hum, like a distant electrical transformer vibrating in Elias's chest. The puddles around him turned into pools of neon purple. When Elias reached the heavy steel door of the lighthouse, he touched the handle. It was warm, pulsing with a faint heat. Below the handle, a small brass plate was engraved into the metal. He rubbed away the grime to read the words, "Property of the Ministry of Regret." The door opened at his touch. Inside, the room was a massive, circular library, far wider than the tower appeared from the outside. Thousands of glass jars lined shelves that stretched up into the darkness. Each jar contained a swirling gray vapor. The light from Elias's flashlight reflected off thousands of glass surfaces, creating a dizzying kaleidoscope of reflections. An iron spiral staircase wound upward into the shadows. Faint whispers emanated from the jars, like steam escaping a kettle. Elias walked to a shelf and picked up one of the jars. The label on it was a white sticker with typed text. Case number 412, loss of the SS Mercy. Guilt of the survivor. Inside, the gray vapor formed the shape of a screaming face before dissolving. A soft, muffled cry came from the jar, and Elias held it at arm's length, his hands shaking. The screaming face had hollowed-out eyes. Then Elias heard a sound from the spiral staircase. He looked up. A woman's shoe, a red velvet heel, was visible on the landing 3 levels up. It was the same shoe his wife, Clara, wore on the night she vanished. The red of the shoe was the only vibrant color in the room, and it seemed to glow in the beam of Elias's flashlight. He climbed. His hands gripped the cold iron railing as he spiraled upward. The clicking of a heel echoed above him, getting louder, then softer, then louder again. When Elias reached the landing, a tall figure in a heavy yellow slicker stepped out from behind a shelf. The keeper had no face, only a smooth, blank surface of wet skin. Rain dripped from the slicker, even though they were deep inside the tower. The keeper swung a heavy iron lantern hook at Elias's head. Elias threw his arm up to block. The hook whistled past, so close he felt the displacement of air on his face. He dived under the keeper's second swing and tackled the figure, his hand sinking into the slicker. It felt cold and oily, like touching something that had been dredged up from the ocean floor. The keeper slammed Elias against the iron railing. Pain exploded in his ribs, a grinding, crushing sensation as the metal dug into his spine. He gasped for air, his face turning red. The metallic clang of the railing rang out like a bell in the circular room. Elias reached into his belt and pulled out a brass multi-tool. He unfolded the blade with shaking fingers and stabbed it into the keeper's arm. Instead of blood, gray vapor poured out of the wound in a hissing stream. The vapor obscured everything, and the keeper let go, stepping back into the shadows with a sound like fabric tearing. Elias pulled himself away from the railing, his chest heaving, his vision swimming. The vapor slowly dissipated around him. He climbed higher. When he reached the registry room, Elias found a small circular office with a mahogany desk. A ledger lay open on its surface, as if someone had been reading it moments before. The pages were yellowed and brittle. He flipped through them carefully. The handwriting changed from 18th century script to modern cursive as he moved through the centuries. He reached the final entry and stopped. It was written in his own handwriting. Elias Thorne. Arrived October 14th. Status: finalized. His hand hovered over the page, unable to move. The grandfather clock in the corner ticked with mechanical precision. Elias looked at his own wristwatch. The second hand was moving backward. The date window on the watch read October 14th, 1924. He heard voices coming from the ceiling. It was a monologue, but the voice was his own. "The lighthouse is a conduit for suppressed fears," the voice said. "It draws to itself those who cannot forgive themselves. It gathers their regrets like a fisherman gathers his nets." Elias looked at a mirror on the wall. He saw himself, but his reflection was wearing the faceless keeper's yellow slicker. As he watched, his reflection's hand reached out toward the glass. Elias turned and ran. The stairs went up, always up. The violet light grew brighter as he climbed, casting everything in shades of purple and black. When he reached the highest room before the lantern chamber, Elias stepped onto a floor made of thousands of the glass jars, packed side by side like honeycomb. There was something else inhabiting her form, something that spoke in a voice like shattering glass. "You let me drown," it said. "You let me go into the tide, and you walked away. Every day for 100 years I have been here, and every day you have been here too, and you never knew." Elias grabbed her wrists. They were cold, so impossibly cold that frost began to form on his fingers where he touched her. They struggled against the rotating lens, the machinery of the lighthouse groaning around them. The machinery began to catch Elias's coat, pulling him toward the gears. He had to choose: fight her or free himself. He kicked her back and used his leather satchel to jam the rotating gears. The effect was immediate. The brass gears shrieked as they tried to continue their rotation against the obstruction. The leather of the satchel tore and compressed. Sparks flew from the metal as the machinery ground to a halt with a violent jerk that shook the entire lantern room. Clara Entity screamed. A sound like shattering glass, like 1,000 jars breaking at once. She released her grip on Elias and grabbed his throat instead, lifting him off the ground. Her grip was like ice, freezing the skin on his neck. Frost formed on the collar of his coat. His feet dangled over the edge of the catwalk, over the empty space of the lighthouse interior far below. "Come with me," she said. "Come with me into the dark." Elias's vision began to darken at the edges. His fingers clawed at her arm, but it was like trying to scratch stone. This wasn't Clara. Clara was gone, had been gone for 100 years. With the last of his strength, Elias threw his weight forward. They tumbled together toward the lantern room wall. The glass shattered as they crashed through it. Elias fell. He fell backward into the night, his arms outstretched, his expression one of total surrender. The lighthouse disappeared above him, shrinking into a tiny pinprick of violet light. But instead of hitting the rocks below, he fell into a void of gray vapor. The wind died out, replaced by a soft, rhythmic pulsing. As he fell, the vapor around him took form. It became photographs. Millions of them, all sepia-toned, all the same moment repeated over and over. The day he reached for Clara's hand in the water. The day he failed to save her. The day the tide took her. Thousands of voices whispered to him as he fell through time itself. Forgive yourself. Forgive yourself. Forgive yourself. The dates on the photographs ranged from 1924 to 2024. 100 years of the same moment, falling endlessly through the dark. Elias's eyes snapped open. He was lying on wet sand, the tide coming in, licking at his boots. The cliff was there. The cliff that the lighthouse had stood upon. But the cliff was empty. Bare rock. No tower. He sat up, coughing up seawater, shivering uncontrollably. His chest ached where the glass shard had cut him. But there was no wound, no blood, nothing but the memory of pain. The dawn light was weak and pale, filtering through the gray clouds. A seagull cried overhead. He checked his pocket. The locket was gone. In its place was a single, small glass jar. It was empty, but the label had his name on it. Instead of a case number, it read simply, "Free." The jar was crystal clear, reflecting the morning sun. Elias stood, his legs weak beneath him, and turned toward the village. He walked through the mist, the empty jar clutched in his hand. The village of Beacon's End was a ruin. The tavern, the Driftwood, was a wreck. The roof had collapsed years ago, vines covering the rotted walls. It hadn't been open in 50 years. Hadn't been open, in fact, since the morning after that terrible night in 1924. The sign hung by a single rusted chain, creaking in the wind. Elias stood in front of the ruins and looked at the tally board where he had seen the men standing last night. It was rotted and blank, illegible. In the center of the village square, he found the memorial stone. It was made of granite, carved with names of the dead and missing, in memory of those lost to the great wave of 1924. The inscription read. Elias ran his finger over the names, searching. He found it. Elias Thorne, missing and presumed dead. Directly beneath it, Clara Thorne, missing and presumed dead. The dates were October 14th, 1924. Elias sat down on the stone bench next to the memorial and held the empty jar up to the morning light. It was absolutely empty, yet it contained everything. All of Clara's absence, all of his failure, all of the regret that the lighthouse had been collecting from him for 100 years. He stood and walked back toward the cliff. The ocean stretched out before him as he reached the edge of the cliff where the lighthouse had stood. The sun was a bright gold now, rising higher into the pale sky. The wind picked up, blowing away the last of the mist. Elias placed the empty jar on a flat stone at the cliff's edge. He stood at the very edge, looking out at the horizon. His form began to turn transparent, shimmering like the gray vapor that had filled the lighthouse. A single pure musical note rang in the air, a sound that came from nowhere and everywhere at once. He whispered something, so softly that the wind almost carried it away. "I'm coming home, Clara." The camera panned down to the jar on the stone. A small, white silk ribbon, the one from the locket, was now inside the jar. The jar was sealed with a cork. The sun reflected off the glass so brightly that everything turned white. The white ribbon inside was pristine and unmoving. The roar of the ocean faded into absolute silence.